Canada just handed out the biggest defense contract in its entire history, and the United States wasn't even in the room. Not because Washington lost the bidding war, because American companies didn't show up to bid at all. Germany's ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems just won the right to build up to 12 new submarines for Canada, a deal Prime Minister Mark Carney himself called the largest military procurement in Canadian history, worth $24 billion upfront, and potentially climbing past $100 billion Canadian dollars once decades of maintenance, infrastructure, and weapons are factored in. And the reason America wasn't competing tells you almost everything you need to know about where Canada's defense relationships are actually heading. Here's what we're covering. First, we'll break down exactly what Canada just announced, the size of this deal, and why Carney called it the biggest procurement in the country's history. Then we'll get into the real reason no American company even entered this competition, a detail that says more about U.S. industrial priorities than anything else in this story. After that, we'll cover who Germany beat to win this, South Korea's Hanwha Ocean, and just how close and hard-fought that fight actually was. We'll look at what Carney himself said about why Germany won, and the surprising move Germany and Norway made to speed up delivery specifically for Canada. And finally, we'll talk about what this deal signals about where Canada's broader defense spending is heading, and why that should worry American defense contractors far beyond just submarines. Let's start with the announcement itself. On July 6th, standing at a naval dockyard in Halifax on his way to the NATO summit in Turkey, Carney named ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems as Canada's preferred supplier for up to 12 new Type 212 CD submarines, replacing the aging Victoria-class fleet Canada bought secondhand from the United Kingdom back in the late 1990s. Carney didn't hedge about the scale of this, calling it plainly the largest defense procurement in Canadian history. Reporting pegs the upfront cost around 24 billion Canadian dollars, with defense analysts estimating the full lifecycle cost, including decades of maintenance, new supporting infrastructure, and weapons systems, could climb as high as 100 billion Canadian dollars over the life of the program. This isn't a routine equipment refresh. This is Canada making one of the largest single financial commitments in its military history, and doing it with a European company at the center of the deal. So why wasn't a single American shipbuilder even in this competition? The answer is almost embarrassingly simple once you hear it. The United States only builds nuclear-powered submarines. Canada, for this program, specifically wanted conventionally powered diesel-electric vessels, submarines built for exactly the kind of coastal and Arctic operations Canada actually needs, rather than the deep ocean, long-range nuclear platforms America specializes in. American industrial capacity simply doesn't produce the type of submarine Canada was shopping for, which meant the world's largest defense economy had nothing to offer its own closest neighbor on its single biggest military purchase in history. That's not a Canadian snub of American technology, it's a structural gap in what U.S. shipyards even build, and it left the entire competition to European and Asian shipbuilders instead. That competition came down to a genuinely close fight between Germany and South Korea. Canada had narrowed the field to two finalists back in August of last year: ThyssenKrupp's German-Norwegian Type 212 CD design against South Korea's Hanwha Ocean and its KSS-3 platform. Hanwha didn't go quietly either, deploying one of its own Republic of Korea Navy submarines all the way from Busan to Victoria, British Columbia, in May, the longest voyage a Korean Navy submarine has ever undertaken, specifically to demonstrate its capabilities to Canadian officials ahead of the decision. Hanwha also built defense industrial offsets into its bid, including armored vehicle and artillery production that would have boosted other parts of Canada's defense sector. In the end, though, Hanwha itself admitted afterward that its bid simply couldn't overcome what it called the barrier posed by the NATO alliance, an implicit acknowledgement that interoperability with European and NATO partners carried real weight in Canada's final decision. Carney explained his reasoning in plain terms at the Halifax announcement, saying the submarine is proven and capable, widely used by allies across the alliance, and noting that TKMS supplies submarines to over a third of NATO members, making it the leading submarine provider to navies around the world. And Germany and Norway didn't stop at simply winning the contract. They made a genuinely striking gesture to close the deal, agreeing to give up their own place in TKMS's production queue so Canada could receive its first 4 submarines by 2034, 2 full years earlier than the company had originally proposed publicly. That's not the kind of concession a supplier makes for a customer it considers replaceable. That's Germany and Norway actively prioritizing Canada's defense needs ahead of their own domestic delivery schedules. Here's why this matters far beyond just submarines. This deal isn't happening in isolation. It's part of a much larger shift in Canadian defense spending that Carney has been building since taking office. Canada has pledged to reach NATO's 2% GDP spending target this year alone, with a fiscal plan already targeting 4% by 2030, ahead of NATO's own timeline, and a longer-term goal of hitting 5% of GDP by 2035. Every dollar of that dramatically expanding defense budget is now a live competition, and this submarine deal just proved, on the largest possible stage, that American companies aren't automatically winning that competition anymore, sometimes because they can't even field a competitive product for what Canada actually needs. To be fair, this isn't purely an anti-American story, and it shouldn't be framed as one. No U.S. company bid because of a genuine industrial mismatch, not because Ottawa deliberately excluded American suppliers the way it has in other recent defense reviews. Contract negotiations with TKMS are still ongoing, and Carney himself acknowledged there's hard bargaining ahead before anything is finalized. But even with that caveat, the optics here are impossible to ignore. Canada's largest ever military purchase, announced on the eve of a NATO summit, went to a European partnership that actively restructured its own production schedule to prioritize Canada, while the United States simply wasn't positioned to compete at all. So that's the full picture, a $100 billion defense relationship that used to be an easy assumption for American shipbuilders, now belonging to Germany and Norway instead, decided on Canada's own terms, for Canada's own needs, with NATO interoperability and European partnership doing the heavy lifting Washington used to take for granted. There's a broader pattern worth connecting here too. This submarine deal landed in the same stretch of 2026 where Canada has been reviewing its F-35 fighter jet order in favor of a possible Swedish Gripen fleet, entering formal negotiations with Saab for globalized surveillance aircraft, and exploring letting Airbus build an entire helicopter manufacturing plant on Canadian soil. None of these are isolated procurement decisions happening by coincidence. They're all playing out at the exact same moment Carney's government is rapidly scaling up defense spending toward NATO's 5% target, which means every major purchase Canada makes over the next decade is now a genuine competition rather than an assumed American sale. Submarines just happen to be the biggest, most visible example yet of a country quietly deciding it no longer needs to default to Washington when it goes shopping for its own security. If you found this breakdown useful, hit like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments. Do you think this is the start of a bigger pattern in Canadian defense spending? Or is submarines simply a category America was never going to win anyway?